Good evening and thank you all, especially the Department of History and Sarah Cornell for inviting me, and the Feinberg family for their generous support of these lecture series, and to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and hear what I have to say today. I want to get started right away and tell you that I want to trace in this lecture the rapid increase in the Hispanic population since the 1970s, when Latinos constituted only 4.5% of the entire US population. So we are really talking about a demographic tsunami that has happened in the last 50 years. The 1980s was dubbed the decade of the Hispanic, and demographers then began speculating what point in the 21st century that whites would constitute a minority of the American population. And that demographic conjecture became front cover news in 1990 when Time magazine first posed the question, what will whites be like? What will the US be like when whites are no longer the majority? Well, I'm not going to attempt to answer that question. For one thing, who knows what the United States is going to be like in 2050? And secondly, because historians, at least I think, historians like to predict the past, not the future. And so I will attempt to accomplish three modest objectives in this talk. First, to give you a indication of the growth and distribution of the Hispanic population since 1980. Second, to suggest that the fear that many people have experienced over the question of illegal immigration and immigration from Mexico has less to do with economics, they take our jobs kind of discourse, and more to do with the fear that immigrants will change America for the worst before America will change them for the better. Okay, and lastly, I will suggest that the Hispanic vote played a significant role in the past presidential election and will continue to grow in importance in the decades to come. So before getting into the demographics, let's take a look at this fear that was generated by so many people in the last 10 years who have written books about this subject, including one particular individual down the road in Cambridge by the name of Samuel Huntington, a political scientist at Harvard who passed away some years ago. He wrote in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine in 2004, the Hispanic challenge, which in a lot of ways is a euphemism for the Hispanic threat, because he wrote, the persistent inflow of Hispanic immigrants threatens to divide the United States into two peoples, two cultures, and two languages. Unlike past immigrant groups, Mexicans and other Latinos have not assimilated into mainstream US culture, forming instead their own political and linguistic enclaves and rejecting the Anglo-Protestant values that built the American dream. The United States ignores this challenge at its peril. These are pretty strong words, don't you think? Huntington packs a lot of assumptions into that paragraph about Latino immigrants, and we don't have time to examine all of them, but a couple of them I think deserve our attention. What exactly does he mean by assimilation into mainstream culture? I mean, what does assimilation mean anyway, and what is main culture in 2004 when he wrote this, or in 2014? Does he mean that, for example, Mexicans should give up nachos and tacos for hot dogs and hamburgers, or bring ketchup back to the kitchen table? No, Huntington is a little bit more concerned about the fact that Latinos don't adopt what he calls Anglo-Protestant culture, and he's specifically referring to Mexicans. And let's leave that question aside for just a moment to consider what I think almost everybody in this room does expect of immigrants in this country. It's certainly embedded in our naturalization laws. We expect them to adopt our political values as embodied in the Constitution, and to swear loyalty to the nation and come to its defense when called. But we have never demanded that immigrants adopt any particular cultural or religious habits, Protestant, Anglo-Protestant, or otherwise. As long as they adopt our ideas about freedom, tolerance, and equality before the law, we have left them to do as they please in their private lives, as well we should. But perhaps the most perplexing of all of Huntington's assumptions is that he says hard work is an Anglo-Saxon value. Well, no doubt it is, but I doubt that Anglo-Saxons have a corner on hard work or that they discovered hard work. And even if they did, is it fair to say that Latinos reject this value? Isn't hard work the value and opportunity the reason so many immigrant groups over the history of our country brave the hardships to come here? You know, speaking for myself, as the offspring of Catholic immigrant grandparents from Chihuahua, Mexico, on my mother's side, and County Kerry, Ireland, on my father's side, I personally don't reject the Protestant work ethic. My problem is that I've too thoroughly assimilated it. I struggle to connect with what I call my Latino Catholic leisure ethic, without much success, I might add. But let's look at a few of the political responses to the Latinization of the U.S. in presidential elections in the past 2 decades. Patrick Buchanan, the author of the first quotation on the slide up there, was an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Ronald Reagan, and he sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1992 against George H.W. Bush and in 1996 against Bob Dole. He also wrote this book with the title Death of the West, How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization. That was a year after 9/11. Mexican Americans, he says, are creating an Hispanic culture separate and apart from America's larger culture. They are becoming a nation within a nation. I frankly don't see any evidence of that. It's to suggest that Mexicans in this country are equivalent to the French in Quebec. They were basically separatists and somehow want to recede or secede from the Union. Last time I checked, the only person who talked about seceding from the Union was Governor Perry, talking about Texas seceding from the Union, not Mexicans. And the second one was from a Republican congressman from Colorado named Tom Tancredo, who also sought the Republican presidential nomination, Republican nomination in the last election. He says, "We are committing cultural suicide. The barbarians at the gate will only need to give us a slight push, and the emaciated body of Western civilization will collapse in a heap." Tancredo alludes here to Mexicans as a kind of Trojan burrito inside the gates of Fortress America. I don't find that very interesting or compelling argument either, and his language is off-putting to say the least. But these are the kinds of people who want to run our country and to run Mexicans out of it. You can look at Cisneros and Clinton responses by contrast when Cisneros just makes a factual acknowledgement of the browning of America. He says that it is allegedly happening and is inescapable, and he's right about that. That's what they were saying in the 1970s and 1980s, the demographers, that it is inescapable because of immigration and fertility rates, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. And in a little quoted statement from President Bill Clinton, he said, "I hope that very much that I'm the last president in American history who can't speak Spanish." Now, as some of you know, George W. Bush did speak some Spanish, and some people suggest that his Spanish was better than his English. Now let's take a look at the Latinization of the population since 2000. I'm sorry, I went ahead one too many. That's good. In 2014, Hispanics now constitute 17% of the U.S. population. That's 1 in 6 Americans. In 2003, Hispanics surpassed blacks as the largest minority group in the United States. Most of us remember that. In 9 of the 10 largest cities in the U.S. today, New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, and San Jose, Latinos now outnumber blacks. In fact, the only two cities today in which blacks outnumber Latinos are Detroit and Philadelphia, among the larger cities. In the next slide, we're going to look at the census projections for Latinos at mid-century, the tipping point when the U.S. becomes a majority-minority country. Here you can see that Hispanics are projected to be 30% of the population at mid-century. About 1 in 3 Americans will claim Hispanic or Latino origin. Now, we're not talking about immigrants, legal or illegal. We're not talking about Spanish-speaking or Spanish surname. We're talking about anybody who identifies as a Latino, like myself. I'm Neil Foley. That's not exactly a Latino name. My father is Irish. My mother is Mexican. But I identify as Latino, okay? So you have, and I'm third generation. So I am the generation that's supposed to be fully assimilated, if you follow the sociological model, right? And I find that that's true. In fact, I find that so many third-generation Latinos can't even speak Spanish. And so the whole question of our becoming a bilingual nation, kind of like the French in Canada, where we'll have to talk to our Latino fellow citizens in Spanish, is fairly absurd. It's just not backed up by the data. Okay. Now, what is driving the surge in the Hispanic population since the 1970s? It's a complicated issue because it involves a lot of different variables from the 1970s up to the present time. But it began with the passage of the Immigration Act in 1965, also called the Hart-Celler Act, that made it possible for immigrants to come to the United States in great numbers. And that is because this act overturned the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which limited immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and favored immigration from Northern Europe. There was a racial dimension to this. We did not like Slavic peoples and Jews from Eastern Europe. We preferred Northern Europeans, the so-called Nordics. We actually believed, on the basis of eugenic science, that there were a hierarchy of races, and even within the Caucasian race, there were superior whites and inferior whites, and Eastern Europeans were inferior whites. Well, the Immigration and Nationality Act, passed in 1965 at the height of the African American Civil Rights Movement, eliminated race and culture from the equation. In other words, it replaced the 1924 law with a race-neutral system of quotas and preferences. And the number one preference for immigrating was family reunification visas. So if you were already in this country and you had some family members, you got them visas, and they came over, and after they fulfilled residential requirements, even up to and including achieving citizenship, then they could invite their family members over, setting off a chain migration that lasts to this day. And the other principal reason for the rapid increase in the Hispanic population is the birth rates of Hispanic women in the United States compared to whites, blacks, and Asians, so-called fertility rates. I apologize for this slide, it's not very clear, but you can see that for whites it's 1.8, Hispanics is 2.4, black 2.1, and Asian 1.8. Hispanic women have the highest fertility rate of all groups at 2.4, while Asians and whites have a 1.8 birth rate, what demographers call a sub-replacement rate. That means their numbers are diminishing. They're not replacing themselves. Interestingly enough, the total fertility rate for Hispanic women in the United States at 2.4 is actually higher than the fertility rate of women in Mexico, which in 2012 was 2.2. You've probably heard of the expression that Mexican women come up here to have anchor babies, from Lou Dobbs and O'Reilly and all the rest on Fox and CNN and so forth, anchor babies. So-called because when they're dropped, human beings give birth to children, but the operative metaphor for Mexicans having birth is dropping babies like livestock. Drop on this side of the border so that those children are anchors. When they turn 18, they then have the right to invite family members over, okay? Well, if the birth rate of Mexican women is actually lower than the birth rate of Hispanic women in the United States, and is close to equal to the birth rate, the average birth rate of the United States of America, which is 2.1, then it gives the lie to the idea that there are tens of thousands of women coming up to the United States to drop anchor babies. It's just a myth, and it's just not backed up by the data. Demographers attribute the decline in fertility rates in Mexico to the same factors that they attribute to any other country in the Western Hemisphere, or in the world for that matter, where birth rates are in a free fall. That is urbanization. City dwellers have fewer children than people in rural areas. Legalization and widespread acceptance and diffusion of contraception. And growing female participation in the workforce that has led many women to delaying the birth of children or not having as many. Now let's look at the top 5 states where Hispanics live. California and Texas, no surprise there, is where they mostly live. Florida, New York, and Illinois. Some of you out there, I hope, are thinking that these states have something else in common. No presidential candidate becomes president without winning most of those states. These 5 states alone account for 171 of the 270 electoral votes needed to become president. That's 63% of the electoral votes in those 5 states, and they happen to be the demographic center of gravity of Latinos. Now you understand why the press and everybody is talking about the 2016 election and which way Latinos are going to go, okay? Latinos don't tend to vote in the numbers that their demographic figures would suggest, in part because a large part of the Latino population in some of the states are immigrants or are not here legally, and also because it's a very young population, right? The median age of Latinos is younger than African Americans, Asian Americans, and whites. Whites being the oldest. The median population of whites in America is like 42. Median population of Latinos, all Latinos, is like 26, which means that their women are more in their child-producing years than whites are, right? Which also contributes. Birth rate is what's driving the rates right now, not immigration, okay? All right, so now let's take a look. And by the way, there are 80,000 Latinos across this country that turn 18 every month. Every month, 800,000 a year, more than 800,000 a year. And demographers are saying that within a couple years, it's going to be 1 million. Every year turning 18, okay? Imagine the implications of that in politics. Now we're going to look at the percentage of Hispanic origin groups so that we can know who they are. There are 55 million Hispanics in the United States, or Latinos, and the vast majority of them, almost 2/3 of them, are Mexican. The second largest group is Puerto Ricans at 9.4. Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. They are U.S. citizens, so they don't factor into the immigration debate. Cubans, the third largest group, 3.7%, most of them located in southern Florida, as Puerto Ricans are mostly concentrated in New York, all right? And you can see the rest, Dominican, Central American, South American, all of the Hispanic, fill out the rest. What I'm going to show you now is where those Mexicans, the demographic center of gravity of the entire Hispanic Latino population in the United States, where they live. To nobody's surprise, they live in the American Southwest. This is 1980 map. Okay, so it is exactly as you probably imagined. Cubans in Florida, Puerto Ricans in New York, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in Chicago, and Mexicans in Detroit since the 1920s, and the rest in the border states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and some other states of the American West, right? Now look what happens, okay? This is 15 years after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, right? 1980 to 1990, right about the time some of your students were born after the 1990s. That's 2000. This was the 1990-2000, a decade of the greatest immigration from Mexico. Now it goes up to 2006. It doesn't go any higher than that. Look at this. You get the idea. I'll go all the way back again. 1990, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2006. They're moving out and into the Midwest, New England, and look at the South. Look at North Carolina and Virginia in 1980. Look at it now. That's North Carolina. I have my little pointer here for those of you who are geographically challenged. That's North Carolina. And what's happening here? This is the New South, right? This is the census breakdown of the 4 regions in the United States. They include Texas in the South because it was an ex-Confederate state. As you'll notice from that Hispanics in the South are 31.2% over the period of 6 years. They've increased their percentage in that region, I think it's 11 states, by 31%, when the total population only increased by 8.5. The second largest increase came in the Midwest, with 26.1% increase in the Hispanic population, when that region only gained 2.7% in the total population. Then comes the West, 21% increase in the Hispanic population, when that region only saw a 9.3 total population increase. And then finally, pulling up the rear, your area of the country, the Northeast, had a net increase of 2%, but a 15% increase in Hispanic. You're probably noticing more Mexicans in Massachusetts than you had 20 years ago. Right? Even Vermont is experiencing a boom in Mexicans. I thought, what are they doing in Vermont? I thought, they can't be skiing. Not that Mexicans don't ski. I've skied. I snowplow with my face as well as anybody else. But they're working on dairy farms. Right? Now, dairy farms are mechanized, but someone has to hook up the machines to the cow, and not a whole lot of people think that's a very interesting or remunerative job, but Mexicans will do it and are doing it. Okay? Here are some of the more popular works sounding out the alarm against the Hispanicization of America. Okay. First, we've already heard from Samuel Huntington. And Victor Hansen wrote a book called Mexifornia. He's talking about California turning into Mexico, basically, and it's more of a Jeremiad and a critique of our Mexican immigration and the laws that somehow aren't enforced to prevent that from happening. Peter Brimlow is an interesting case. He wrote Alien Nation. It was a national bestseller in the 90s. And it was, he was an immigrant from England. And this bestseller, he says in there that, and this is a direct quote, again, think of the language they're using here, that he's using. America will become a freak among the world's nations because of the unprecedented demographic mutation it is inflicting on itself. Now, this may sound odd that one immigrant would be talking about the United States becoming a freak nation, inflicting a mutation upon itself, when he himself is an immigrant. But as he goes on to say, he says, that's different. White immigrants are okay. The problem is you've got all these immigrants coming from Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador and Mexico and all these other countries that are going to ruin America. This is starting to sound like some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric of prior decades. Think back to the 1880s, 1920s, Nativism, that gave us the 1924 immigration law. So in 1994, California passes Proposition 187 to save our state proposition. Overwhelmingly passes this. Something like 55% of the people voted on this. And this is not a debate. We keep talking about the immigration debate, but what this is a history of the demonization of Mexican immigrants and other non-European immigrants to this country. Fast forward 16 years later, and you get Arizona's SB 1070, Senate Bill 1070, which gave police the power to check the immigration status of anyone arrested or detained if there was a reasonable suspicion that they were in the country illegally. Many US-born Latinos, like the ones you see in this image of protest against SB 1070, Mexican Americans, if you think I'm illegal because I'm a Mexican, learn the true history because I'm in my homeland. They protested that the law fundamentally legalized racial profiling. That would be like driving a pickup while brown. Shortly after its passage, copycat bills were introduced and passed in 5 states: Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, South Carolina, and Utah. And you notice all the southern states there because they're the ones that are experiencing this influx of Mexicans. Then the backlash against the backlash, I call it, happened in 2006 when this man on the left up here, that's Congressman James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, sponsored a bill that would essentially redefine undocumented immigrants as felons and punish anyone guilty of providing them assistance. This was a draconian measure, but it nevertheless passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 239 to 182, with 92% of Republicans supporting the bill and 82% of Democrats opposing it. This is what the bill did. It made being in the country illegally an aggravated felony, which would subject unauthorized immigrants to sentencing guidelines similar to those for murder, rape, and the sexual abuse of a minor. The bill also required a 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence for anyone providing relief or aid to unauthorized immigrants. That meant that public school teachers, church workers, healthcare workers, and anybody else who worked with unauthorized immigrants could be convicted and sentenced to mandatory prison terms. This passed overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives and spawned the protests in 50 cities across the nation, including 1 million people in Los Angeles, where you see this, and Dallas experience, where I'm from, at SMU, experienced 500,000 people in the streets of downtown Dallas, the largest public demonstration in that city's history, larger than any civil rights demonstrations of the 60s. Okay? They were upset that unauthorized immigrants were going to be labeled felons. These were not obviously just immigrants marching here. These were Americans of all backgrounds who just thought that this was crazy, that they would actually pass a bill like this. And of course, the bill died in the Senate. When they saw the response of the American people to that bill, they just let that bill die, okay? Look at the signs that they were carrying, because these signs were very, very instructive. In Spanish, the signs read, "Hoy marchamos, mañana votamos," which means today we march, tomorrow we vote. And vote they did. Okay, now let's look at the issue of how comprehensive immigration reform played out in the 2012 election, and I'll be done. All right, Obama won the election with 71% of the Hispanic vote. Romney won with just 27%, the lowest of any presidential candidate in 16 years. In the swing states of Florida, Colorado, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia, Obama won an average of less than 40% of the white vote and still won all 5 states. Romney got the largest share of the white vote for a Republican since Ronald Reagan and still lost. Now let's look at some of their contrasting views. In 2012, Obama issued DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, AKA Dreamers. These are immigrants who were brought to the United States as children by their parents. Here's what Obama said: "These young people pledge allegiance to our flag. They are Americans in their heart, in their minds, in every single way but one, on paper. They were brought to this country by their parents and often have no idea that they're undocumented until they apply for a job or a driver's license." Let's switch to Romney. When asked during the Republican primary debate in January 2012 how he would solve the 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, he said the answer is self-deportation. Just imagine 11 million people self-deporting. He also vowed to veto the DREAM Act to give children undocumented parents a path to citizenship. 2 weeks before the election, Obama told the Des Moines Register, "I will just be very blunt. Should I win a second term, a big reason I will win is because the Republican nominee and the Republican Party have so alienated the fastest growing demographic group in the country, the Latino community." This is the way one Latino cartoonist pictured what was happening, kind of summed up the outlook on the GOP and upcoming elections. Let me just conclude with a very few brief thoughts. I don't want to suggest that the majority of Latinos voted for Obama only because, or even primarily, because of his stand on immigration. Latinos comprise many sub-ethnic groups and nationalities, making it difficult, if not impossible, to predict how they will vote in an election. Latino voters include middle-class homeowners, plumbers and professors, urban elites and rural evangelicals, as well as agricultural workers and service workers and people living just below or above the poverty line, construction workers, nannies. The list goes on. Latino voters are white and black, they're gay and straight, they're Catholic Protestants and Jews, they're Spanish-speaking, and they're English monolinguals. The point is, Latinos now matter in national elections, and alienating them can cost the election. Stay tuned. We'll see what happens in 2016 if the GOP continues to alienate the Latino vote. Thank you very much.